You are listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Radio here on the Stargate Disclosure Affiliate YouTube channel. Visit the official UnknownCountry.com website for the latest news, publications, and access to our vast membership archive.
Joining us from London is metallurgist, engineer, and religious scholar Robert Feather. In his earlier book, The Mystery of the Copper Scroll of Qumran, Robert analyzed the Dead Sea Scroll engraved on copper that is considered the work of the secretive devout Jewish sect known as the Essenes, who lived at Qumran around the time of Jesus and John the Baptist. In his new book, The Secret Initiation of Jesus at Qumran, Feather builds on his research into the connections between the ultra-mysterious Egyptian mystic Akhenaten and the monotheism that became Judaism. He reveals that something extraordinary, as yet not revealed, may have occurred at or near to Qumran. Who were the Essenes, and why are certain modern authorities not keen for the evidence of their connection to Akhenaten to become public? One thing is certain, the modern story of the Essenes is still being written, and there are many, many more secrets to be revealed. Our guest today, Robert Feather, is making extraordinary contributions to this effort. Robert, welcome to Dreamland.
Good morning, William.
It's really great to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I've been a fan of yours ever since the Copper Scroll Decoded came out in '99. It's one of those books that I can actually remember picking up at the post office and sitting down to read. I was in a parking lot and read it while I was waiting for my girlfriend, and I loved everything about it. I connected with it in a really unusual way, and I was very, very interested, therefore, when I saw that your new book was available. It's a massive 457 pages. It's an astonishing body of work. What's been the response to this work so far?
Pretty, I don't know, laid back, I would say, would probably be a fair comment. I mean, it's selling well. That's something which is important to me, obviously. But the reaction from scholars and knowledgeable academics has not been what I would call dramatic, although I think some of the things that I'm talking about and claiming are extremely revelatory and should elicit a response. I do get the feeling, and some people that I have spoken to have kind of said, well, it's kind of gobsmacked them and they don't really know how to respond to it.
Well, it opens up such new territory as part of it. Let's, if you wouldn't mind, begin for a moment in the past here and talk about the Essenes and who they are. While no one is certain of the origins of this strange and reclusive sect, it is known they wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and then they suddenly vanished. Who were the Essenes in your mind, and what do you think that they were really all about?
Well, first of all, calling them Essenes is a tricky one. People do, because there's almost no other word that is generally accepted to describe them. But they never actually called themselves Essenes. That term doesn't appear in their own writings or texts. It's a name put onto them by Greek and Roman historians of the period, Philo, Josephus, Pliny, people like that. If they called themselves anything, it was the community, the Covenanters, the Yachad, the people of the book and the Sons of Light. The descriptions that they give themselves give you an indication of what they were on about. And as you rightly say, they suddenly seem to disappear from the radar screens of the first century CE, or AD if you like, around about 68 CE, when the Romans took revenge for an uprising in 66 and 65 and 66 and came down and literally destroyed all the fortifications, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and a couple of years later in 70 CE, and en route to Jerusalem destroyed the community that we'll call them Essenes for want of a better word, were living at by the Dead Sea in Qumran. They've been there for about 240 years, around about 150 BC. They are known to have arrived from archaeological record. But where they came from, their beliefs, their special form of religion, which was quite different from anything being practiced elsewhere in Judea, that requires a long dissertation, if you like, and I can outline some of it as we go along. But they were split off from the main religious group. But I believe that they'd been split off for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that you can actually trace their split, their divergent view, right the way back through Ezekiel in the 7th century BC, through to Moses in the Exodus period, 1200 BC, and right the way back to this mysterious Pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt.
And that right there, that tracing that you've just done, that is revolutionary in my view. I mean, as you read the text, it suddenly reveals that for certain that they had, without question, an allegiance not only to the past, but also found themselves or looked upon themselves as custodians, in a sense, of the light of truth. Talk about that and what it meant to them and why they had to segregate themselves in the way that they did, and how their allegiance to the past, and especially to Akhenaten, set them up in contrast to the other religious groups at the time.
Okay, I mean, there are a number of markers that you can look at, and they're well acknowledged and unknown, but they're not really understood as to why they behaved in the way they did. One thing they did was to follow a solar calendar, so their festivals, their celebrations, as it were, even Sabbath, which normally would begin in the evening of Friday at sunset and remain intact, as it were, until Saturday, to sundown on Saturday. They didn't have that. For them, the Sabbath began on Saturday morning and finished on Sunday morning. So they were dancing to a different tune in terms of their festivals, which if you celebrate Easter at Christmas, for instance, you're following a different pattern of a religion, and that was equivalent to what they were doing. They didn't go to the temple in Jerusalem. They wouldn't go there to worship. That wasn't the right temple for them. Their own texts, of which there are hundreds of very readable and decipherable manuscripts, mainly written on papyrus, parchment, some on leather, where they describe their own beliefs, their own prayers, their own attitudes. And the temple, the second temple that Herod had reconstructed and enlarged and rebuilt, was an area they would not go to. And that was, again, completely alien. They believed in predestination. They believed in dualism, which was a sort of good and evil. They were the sons of light, and the evil were the sons of darkness. These were concepts quite alien to normal Jewish tradition. And those are just four examples of things where they stood quite separately. And, okay, those things are acknowledged and written about, but no one sort of says, well, why? Why do they follow a solar calendar? Why wouldn't they go to the temple? Where did they get this idea of predestination, dualism? And monogamy was something they advocated, although the particular community of Qumran were probably only celibate, were only male, and there's an explanation for that. But none of the sort of roots of these traditions and beliefs that they adhered to are explained by modern scholarship. But they are explained if you trace them back to Akhenaten, to Egypt, and to the things that were going on at Amarna in about 1350 BCE.
And of course, Akhenaten is referred to by scholars as the heretic king. He's referred to as an aberration, somebody who is in fact reviled during his time. He was, in a sense, at war with the established religious and political authorities of his time. His religious revolution cast Egypt into chaos. And it seems that here come the Essenes attempting to maybe not duplicate what he had done, but certainly to revive the religious revolution that was inaugurated by Akhenaten. The Essenes remind me in this sense a little bit of the League of Shadows in the movie Batman Returns. It was a league of an ancient group dedicated to preserving what it perceives as justice, and was seeking to tear down, at least in the movie, the established empire, if you will. And I wonder, is this why the Essenes refused to worship in the Temple of Solomon, rebuilt by Herod? Did they perceive the empire at that time as a force of evil that they had to segregate themselves from, and in every way separate themselves from?
Pretty well, yes. But I think it wasn't just at that period. It was a separation that they kept all the way through, right the way back from Sinai. And not going to the temple is an interesting question to look at. Briefly, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are generally defined as something like 85,000 odd bits and pieces of sometimes complete scrolls, sometimes tiny fragments, that were discovered in 11 caves running along about 2 miles to 3 or 4 kilometers from their settlement on the Dead Sea. And the first of these were discovered in the spring of 1947. And they comprised something like 850 different documents included in all the fragments. Right. We've got to hold on for a bit, have we?
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Robert Feather. We're talking about the Essenes and their resistance to worship at the Temple of Solomon. Please go ahead, Robert.
Okay, so these are 850 documents represented by about 85,000 fragments or sometimes complete scrolls. Can be divided roughly into 3 groups. Biblical texts. These are texts of what we now know as the Old Testament, and examples from every single book of the Old Testament, including 2 almost complete sections, all 66 verses of Isaiah, examples from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all the other books except for Esther. Esther is the one book that they've never found anything that they can be sure of came from that. So there's biblical texts from the Old Testament, or what was to become the Old Testament. There were sectarian texts which described the beliefs, activities, the function, and the writings of this strange community, this Yachad, this Essene Sons of Light group. And then there were other pseudepigraphic and apocryphal texts that biblical religious texts that some were known about previously from extant Greek versions and references to them by other historians, and pseudepigraphic, which are really religious texts that may have been vaguely known about but weren't available, but they appeared amongst the collection of Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. So in the sectarian group, there are a number of documents which talk in great detail about the temple, or a temple. There's a temple scroll, which is the longest of all the scrolls. It's about 11 feet long, and that was discovered discovered earlier, but actually recovered by the Israelis, by Yigal Yadin in Bethlehem in 1967, when the Israelis reconquered the West Bank and the whole of Jerusalem. He sent some of his officers down to Bethlehem, where he knew a dealer had mentioned that he might have this scroll, and he recovered the scroll from him. So that was the last major item to come into the possession of the academics, as it were, and it's now on view in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. That temple scroll described in great detail the layout, the design, and the functions of a temple. A temple that was far too big to fit on the Holy Mount, where the existing temple of Herod stood. It just was vast, and the measurements of this temple and the number of courts of worship were given, and they conflicted completely with the design specified in the Old Testament for the Jerusalem temple. It gave the measurement as 800 meters by 300 meters, 1,600 cubits by 600 cubits. You take a cubit to be about 51 centimeters. That huge dimension was so big it would have fallen off the edge of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It was just too vast. But lo and behold, it turns out to be almost exactly the dimensions of the great temple of Akhenaten at his capital city in Egypt.
That's incredible.
Well, these are the sort of reasons, I think, why they didn't go to the temple, because they had a vision. People say this is a visionary temple, this is something of imagination, but it's too detailed. It's far, far too detailed to be a made-up version. There's another temple, a scroll that describes the temple. It's called the New Jerusalem Scroll by scholars, but it, like the temple scroll, never mentions the name Jerusalem. It never actually says this temple is to be built in Jerusalem. It never says that. And it again describes in great detail a temple very similar to the described in the temple scroll, which can only be the same temple of Akhenaten in Egypt.
And the scenes, I'm sorry, the scenes that you see of Akhenaten's temple at Amarna, it reminds you of the Summer of Love in 1967. You see intimate family scenes. You see a different use of color. It's extraordinarily lively. It's very loving, very joyful. And what I wonder, is it possible that this understanding that the Essenes weren't worshiping or idolizing in any way the temple at Jerusalem, could that be in part why modern scholarship ignores so much of the Dead Sea Scroll material? Because Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is founded upon the idea that that dot of real estate atop Mount Moriah is the most sacred place on the planet. And the Essenes are saying, not really. It's actually Akhenaten's temple that is the holy place where we want to find our sacred teachings and something that we would be interested in participating in. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, that's a very enlightening comment, actually, William, because I hadn't quite considered that resistance from fundamental religious theologians, and that's where the sort of avoidance of the Dead Sea Scroll comes really into its own. Fundamental Christians, Orthodox Jews, or very fundamentalist Muslims will not look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is crazy because they are authentic documents written mainly in Hebrew, some in Aramaic, written 2,000 years plus years ago. They're the oldest known collection of religious material we've ever discovered relating to the three Western religions. And they have enormous amount of information and light to throw on the Old Testament, on the New Testament, and the Quran. And yet they are minimalized by a lot of scholars, a lot of theologians. And I never actually thought about that idea of the temple being one of the motivations for the fear. I know the fear for Orthodox Jewry is that biblical texts that are available amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate absolutely clearly that there were various strands of books which became the Old Testament in existence, which varied from one to the other. So there wasn't a canonical text. There wasn't a one irrefutable, unchangeable text available 2,000 years ago. There were many versions of the same text, and they were solidified later. And that, of course, is a threat to orthodoxy because it undermines the idea that the Bible was given to Moses as one chunk, absolutely complete, unchangeable. We know that there were various different versions of it floating around at that period. So that's the inhibition for Orthodox Jewry. But this temple idea is a very interesting idea as well. The Christians, the the inhibition was rather different. Initially, there was a real excitement that these scrolls might talk about Jesus, might be the first real proof that Jesus existed and tell us more about him. And that turned into, well, I can't say fear, but certainly diffidence, because there's no mention of Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
But what there is clear evidence of great intimate knowledge of these sectarian, these very secretive texts in the early followers of Jesus. They knew an awful lot about these texts, and that's where the fear for Christianity came in, and the problems, if you like, although I don't see that they should be problems. They're being viewed in the wrong way.
Right. You're talking about one of my pet peeves, which is the way contemporary Christianity tends to portray Jesus and John the Baptist as these sort of docile, holier-than-thou religious figures, but the picture that I start to get of it is that these were hardcore esoteric researchers. They were looking for something. And what I'm wondering is, what do you think they might have been looking for, Robert?
Looking for, in the sense of proof.
Why this? Yeah, I mean, let's take a step further. Let's say that Jesus was a prophet of Akhenaten. And do we find evidence of Akhenaten's teaching and imagery was transferred across and reflected in the early Jesus movement and later Christianity? And could it be that the people of the community, the sons of light, the children of light, who we call the Essenes, were actually collecting these ancient texts in order to formulate or reformulate a very powerful esoteric religious teaching?
You've jumped ahead enormously, and you've made a huge deduction, which is valid, which is absolutely correct, and I would kind of build up to it a bit more, because it's a profound conclusion that Christianity owes allegiance or knowledge right the way back to Akhenaten. I think it's a truth, but it needs to be spelled out very carefully. But it's an incredibly exciting idea. It's an incredibly exciting idea. But the continuity, if what I'm maintaining in my new book, this book on the secret initiation of Jesus at Qumran, it in essence says that there was a huge connection between the early followers of Jesus himself, and certainly John the Baptist, to the Essene community. And of course, you need to demonstrate that through text, literary, and archaeological evidence, which I can and do. Absolutely unbelievable findings in the new book. But the corollary of that is that early Christians, early followers of Jesus, I don't like to call them Christians, but that period, right the way back to sort of 30 CE, before Paul has come on the scene. It's not Christianity yet. It's not been sort of solidified into a kind of formal religion as such. But if there is a continuity, then that continuity should go all the way back. If there's a continuity from the Essenes back to Akhenaten, and a continuity forward into the early followers of Jesus, then the early followers of Jesus would also have that awareness of the continuity back to Akhenaten. And that's an incredibly exciting idea when you start looking at it and saying, well, what does that mean? What would that predict if this is the correct theory? Because a good theory will predict things before you even start to think about them. You can then start asking questions and saying, well, if that's the correct theory, such and such should be right. Let's go and look and see if that's right. And lo and behold, when you do that, you find that it does work. Things fit into place like bits of a jigsaw, falling perfectly into slots that are waiting there to be filled. And I said that the academic community has been relatively silent on the reception of my new book. There are a number of scholars, quite eminent scholars, who put themselves four square behind the idea. One of them is the professor Harold Ellens of Michigan University, who has gone through the work with a fine-tooth comb, and he's come out at the other end and said this basically works. This is a valid theory and answers many, many questions that have been puzzling scholars and theologians.
I thought that Professor Ellens wrote a very courageous foreword to your book, where he said, hey, this is valid. This has a lot of merit here, and we're going to have to really start looking at this situation through the lens provided by the secret initiation. We need to, as you mentioned a moment ago, sort of build a bridge between the time of Jesus and John the Baptist and the time of Akhenaten. And in the book, you present a very, what I thought was quite startling connection in the form of Melchizedek. Talk with us for a moment about Melchizedek and his possible role in this scenario.
Okay, let me just diverge for a little bit, because raising Melchizedek is a very pertinent point, and we should look at him because he's a figure of great mystery. But there are so many figures mentioned and referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so many situations, even the origins of the community itself, which you asked, your original question was, where did they come from? You ask back an academic scholar, and they say, well, they split off from the Second Temple around sometime in the 2nd century BCE. Well, frankly, that's just not good enough. It's not good enough because they came to the desert environment with documents that dated back 300 or 400 years before that time, already written, including the Copper Scroll, which they copied from an earlier document. So they were already a long time separated out in their ideas. That kind of, well, we're not sure, we don't know, that carries right on into Melchizedek, the teacher of righteousness, the man of lies, the wicked priest, the whole aspects of the things I talked about before, why they followed a solar calendar, why they didn't go to the temple, why they were dualistic, why they believed in predestination, why they believed in sharing all their goods in community, why they buried their dead in unmarked, virtually naked, in a very unusual form of burial in graves, why their building was orientated exactly the same as that of the great temple at Amarna, why they wrote about different temples, different practices. No one seems to answer those. And Melchizedek is one of the big gray areas, but no one will tell you who Melchizedek was. And in Hebrew terms, it means king priest. Melchizedek is a king. Melech is the Hebrew word for king, and tzedek is a Hebrew word for a priest or a righteous person. So it's a combination name. And he first turns up in Genesis when Abraham meets him, having helped him recover his losses from rebellious kings that have attacked Salem. Salem was the old name for the capital city, Jerusalem, or as it became the capital city of Judea. Abraham helps them. And there's a very telling encounter after he returns the lost goods to this king. The king says, "What shall I give you? Shall I give you a tithe for your tithe being a tenth of what I own, virtually, for the deed that you've done?" And he says, in the name of Elyon, which is God Most High, I will do this for you. And Abraham replies in exactly the same phrase. It says, virtually saying, your God is my God, Elyon is my God and your God. But this is a heathen, apparently heathen king. And he's referred to as Melchizedek, this king of Salem. And Abraham is clearly worshipping the same God. Now, this period, I think, is relatively close to the period of Akhenaten. And although Abraham, in terms of historical combination, probably is meant to predate Joseph and Jacob. He's a predecessor of them, a patriarch, the first Hebrew patriarch, the first Islamic patriarch, if you like, as well. He's the father of Islam, too.
Sure.
But his story is written later, and he is acknowledging Elyon as the same God that Melchizedek worships, because they are both talking about a God that Akhenaten has, if you like, adhered to, has come to recognize as one supreme omnipotent God. So there isn't a conflict in Abraham acknowledging what appears to be a pagan king's God, because they're both worshipping the same one pure God that Akhenaten had enunciated. And Melchizedek was a vassal of Akhenaten. He was there in Salem, in Jerusalem. Akhenaten actually says in some of his writings, and we have tablets of Akhenaten's writings, the Amarna tablets, where he says, Jerusalem, I will put my name in Jerusalem, it will be a holy place forever for me. And so it's not surprising that Jerusalem becomes the most holy place for the Hebrews when they come out of Egypt. Akhenaten has already told them, that's the place that is where my name will reside. So where were we? We strayed quite a bit from...
Well, we were making the link between Melchizedek, Akhenaten, and Jesus, who later was a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
Well, that's right. And Melchizedek starts out in Genesis and then starts to transmogrify, if you like, into something more spiritual, becomes a kind of an ethereal being, almost some kind of angelic figure.
And there seems to have been some tremendous knowledge, I think, that may have been imparted by Melchizedek to Abraham, because we remember in the book of Genesis story, Abraham at first does not have an H in his name, nor does his wife Sarah. But after their encounter with this priest king, suddenly they are transformed. They are given the letter H in their name. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarah is given an H at the end of her name. And it appears that this H may have represented some form of transfer of knowledge, perhaps an attunement of some kind. And I wonder if that is indicative of this teaching of the light that perhaps the Essenes were actually seeking as well.
Well, it's another wonderful insight, William, actually. I mean, you're absolutely right. Abraham's name changes in the Bible from being Abram to Abraham, and Sarah becomes, from Sarah, becomes Sarah. And something happens to them to warrant this change of name. And I think you put your finger right on it. They have now recognized the one omnipotent, invisible, almighty God. The same God that Melchizedek, this apparently pagan king, also recognizes. And Melchizedek stays in traditional Jewish writing all the way through, right down to the time of the Qumran Essenes, and they write about him a lot. They describe his attributes. He's a kingly, princely figure. He's a high priest and a king and a prince, all combined in one figure. Mm-hmm. And they describe a lot of his characteristics. And it's also very highly significant, I think, that Jesus has to become associated with Melchizedek. If you read in the New Testament, there are passages which refer to Jesus taking on the mantle of Melchizedek, priest forever. He's described Jesus has to also have that linkage. And there's a reason for that. I think this sort of, does it answer questions before you answer them? It does. He has to be associated with Melchizedek because that's the fundamental prime initiator. Together, I think, with Jacob and Joseph, who are in at the beginning of the formation of monotheism with Akhenaten. But Jesus needs to define his lineage right the way back to Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, as you said, is described as a king and a priest without genealogy. He doesn't have any genealogy. He's the first. He's the first mm-hmm. of the line. And that makes absolute sense because Akhenaten separated his whole community. He literally upped the court from Thebes, and he said, we're not going to stay with all these pagan temples, Amun, Khons, Mut, all the pagan gods. They're out now. There's only going to be one god. His name is Aten, and he's invisible. And I'm going to build a new city halfway between Memphis and Thebes, roughly where Cairo is now, down to Luxor, in the middle of Egypt, a new virgin city. And that's where we're going to worship this new invisible god. And he goes about destroying all the other gods and temples and chiseling out the inscriptions. He is the cradle of monotheism, that place and Akhenaten, and Jacob and Joseph, the Hebrew patriarchs, who are there with him. And that's how the knowledge of his revolutionary ideas come out with the Hebrews. They're passed down to Moses, and Moses brings them out. There's a continuous, clear, logical, coherent way of describing all these mysterious names and people that pop up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Melchizedek is, to my mind, he's a combination of Akhenaten and his holy priest, his high priest, Merira. He's actually a combined figure. He's a kind of messianic figure that they conceive. And they describe in great detail. And if you analyze their descriptions, it's quite clear. They've just pooled Akhenaten and his high priest into one. They've merged him into one figure who they revere.
Yeah, and at the heart of it, it seems to be to conceal his initiation. And it seems that what you're proposing in the secret initiation of Jesus at Qumran is that John the Baptist and Jesus were part of a movement to reconfigure those teachings and, in effect, to create a spiritual transformation with individuals. Is that a fairly accurate assessment of where you're going with this?
I think so. I mean, you said earlier on that did the Qumran community, did they sort of consciously set about describing the basic philosophy for a new religion? I don't think so. I think they were following a long line of tradition, and the new religion was fashioned by Jesus and John the Baptist and Paul, who took the basic ideas and they said, well, hang on, we're getting away from them here. The Jewish religion, the surrounding culture has gone a long way from these ideal principles of Akhenaten. Let's get back to them. So it's Jesus that constructs and has the divine revelation to go back to a pure religion.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Robert Feather. Robert, recently Time magazine named the rock star Bono and Bill Gates and his wife Melinda Gates as Persons of the Year. And, you know, Bono is admittedly messianic. He accepts that he's a rock and roll messiah and he's working on debt relief. Bill Gates is the richest man in the world. He's utterly Solomonic and is the partner to the king of the world. Melinda Gates, his wife, is somewhat Mary Magdalene-ish. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on comparing Bono and the Gateses to the role of Jesus and John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene? Are there modern figures that give us any kind of clue as to how these figures would have been revered in their contemporary time, and if their lives had been allowed to play out, any indication of what the actual revolution that they inspired might have created?
Wow, that's a heck of a question, isn't it? I mean, I'm trying to think of any contemporary figures that might inspire people the way some of the earlier biblical characters did, Jesus in particular. And I suppose, I don't know, someone like Billy Graham kind of gets into that mold, but that's a real.
It's a subjective question. So I appreciate you're just kind of considering it for us. You don't have to answer if you don't want. I'm just, looking always to get an idea of if these were real people, and I believe they were real people. What were they like? What were their true ambitions? Not the ambitions that were overlaid on top of them, and wondering if the scrolls or other texts give us any kind of hint of what they were truly trying to accomplish? And if we were to really be able to fully revive some of these, the mystery schools and these secret initiations, what would have happened to me? Like, for example, if I were to have encountered John the Baptist and I received this secret initiation at Qumran, what would that have been like? What might that experience entail?
I don't know. I suppose you've got to put your mind back 2,000 years and think, what do these people know about their life? And you've got to forget all the modern scientific and literary works that you've absorbed. Their main concerns were survival. In that time, the Romans were very harsh in conquering people and in control of the land. So religion was pushed back onto them as their salvation. And they were looking for some kind of savior, if you like, as the Jewish people and the world, in some ways, has been looking for a long time. Someone to get them out of their troubles, and so they foresaw an apocalyptic age when the good would overcome the evil, and the forces of good would vanquish the forces of evil. And I suppose that idea is still current. So come someone like John the Baptist with a message that he will save you, but he not necessarily physically, but spiritually, and that's very attractive. You would have succumbed to it. You'd have said, okay, I'm laboring under a harsh regime. I can hardly make enough food for my children. And here's someone who's promising me, even if my physical life is going to be a disaster, and even if I die, there's something to look forward to in the future. I think you'd have probably latched onto that, as people still do. And that is one of the great draws of religion. I was thinking when you mentioned Bono and Bill Gates, we have over in England, in London, particularly Madonna.
Of course, yes.
Come to a form of spiritual enlightenment in becoming an adherent of Kabbalah. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting subject to talk about. I suppose we could almost have another program on that.
Well, Whitley's got the subscriber section coming. That might be a great topic for
yeah.
Based on your... I'm sorry?
A lot of quite well-known, high-profile people who've taken on Kabbalah and been attracted to it.
Mm-hmm. Based on your understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are we awaiting a Messiah today?
Yeah, I suppose, yes. Certainly the Qumranites, the people were waiting for two Messiahs, not just one, two, probably three. And the Jewish people are still waiting for a Messiah. He might come in the form of Elijah. He might come in the form of somebody else that we don't yet know about. And of course, Islam is also waiting for the hidden Messiah. So yes, people are still anticipating a Messiah who'll come along and tell us where we've all gone wrong and lead us to the correct path. Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Judeo-Christian Islamic triangle, because a new kind of triangle has formed in our world that has grave political consequences, religious consequences. Certainly people are dying because of it today. It's not a pretty thing. And what I'm wondering, are there hidden links within the corpus of these three religions? And do you think that there's a link between the Quran and the Quran and Qumran? Is there a fourth way behind these three religions that your research can help us get to?
Well, the idea that the name of the Quran and Qumran are linked is interesting. I must say, another one of your flashes of genius. It's got a similar kind of sound to it, and maybe there is a harking back. You usually find there's a seed of truth behind some kind of similarity in sound. And of a name particularly, but of course they're all basic, fundamental daughter religions of Akhenaten and reiterate Jacob and Joseph, the Hebrew patriarchs. They're all spin-offs from that first golden revelation flash of lightning that occurred when they discovered the idea of one invisible God. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all daughters of that same inspirational moment. So I think if there is a solution to some of the world's problems, it's for all three religions to recognize that they have exactly the same point source of origin, and their differences are really, really trivial in relation to that basic great truth. And they should get back and understand that more and follow its basic teachings. They're beautiful teachings. They are beautiful, beautiful teachings. If you read the great hymn of Akhenaten, which is still visible on several tomb walls at Amarna, you can go and you can see them. And the great hymn is all about praising and acknowledging and thanking this omnipotent power for the wonderful world that we have, and how to behave in it, how to be good in it. It's there, and this idea of opening it up to fellow man, that was one of his ideas. He opened up the ancient temples, Egyptian temples of worship, from being dark, hidden, cloistered, secretive places where only the high priests could venture. He opened it up to the people, and I think that's something that Jesus latched onto as one of the teachings that he saw in the Essene texts and knew about because I think he was a member of the community at Qumran. It's one of the, I'm not the first person to maintain that. I think it's fairly revolutionary in the consequences that follow from that. He has to be a learned person. And the New Testament talks of Jesus as being a carpenter who comes from Nazareth in the Galilee. And yet, all the way through the New Testament, he's able to debate and astound people when he preaches. His knowledge is enormous. It's rather difficult to see and envisage a carpenter who's variously referred to as a rabbi studying under a Pharisaic rabbi, Gamaliel. Okay, that might have given him the knowledge, but the descriptions of his upbringing are very varied and not convincing. It's not convincing, and the general idea that Christianity came out of Pharisaic Judaism, I think, is wrong. That's the normal current conviction, but is wrong. Christianity or early Jesusism came out of this very devout community of we'll call them Essenes living at Qumran. And if you start looking at it in detail, and you have to analyze it very, very carefully, and I do in my new book, and I don't know if you've had a chance to study some of the passages. If you look at some of the passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls and compare them with passages in the New Testament, you find that there are clear, unique quotations that don't appear in any other Jewish text. In fact, unknown in Jewish tradition, but they're picked up. And the only way that can have happened is that the earliest followers of Jesus, and I think I mean by that John the Baptist and Jesus himself, were privy to these texts, knew them, and passed on their knowledge to the people who eventually wrote down the New Testament.
Robert, I know that the secret initiation of Jesus at Qumran is going to have a tremendous impact on not just the lay reader, but also on scholars who follow this incredible trail. What I'm wondering is, where are you off to next? What's your next project?
Wow. If I told you, you wouldn't believe me, because it's completely different. Although I'm following the same thread, and I will write more historical and religious books, because that's where my main interest lies. But I'm actually writing a book on a jazz character at the moment.
You are?
Wow. Which is a bit offbeat from what we're talking about. Someone called Vic Lewis, who was a band leader of the 1950s. So slight diversion from what I'm doing now, but it's not. It's just a hobby and a love interest that I follow, jazz and music. But I will continue my studies on this period, and I have some more startling revelations to make in that direction.
Well, we'll certainly look forward to those revelations, and it's been an absolute pleasure and honor speaking with you today, sir, and we'll hope to speak with you again soon on Dreamland.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much.
This is Whitley Strieber. This is Dreamland.